Good afternoon, Luis Montoya and Oriana Mayorga. Thank you for joining us here with TribeHerald, talking about drug decriminalization and drug policy and how it impacts communities of color. Luis, would you like to introduce yourself and talk about some things you've been doing?
Yeah, thank you so much for having us here, Yitz. My name is Luis Montoya. I'm currently serving as the Interim Executive Director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. SSDP is an international grassroots organization of young people who are invested in ending the war on drugs and in bringing forward a better future for people who use them. SSDP in particular centers young people in drug policy reform. So even as we legalize or decriminalize cannabis, we are thinking specifically about how young people are impacted, are considered or are not considered in a lot of these efforts.
And Oriana, would you like to introduce yourself and talk about some things you've been doing?
Sure. Oriana Mayorga, she, her, ella. I'm a full-time graduate student at Union Theological Seminary. I serve on the board of directors and I serve in many different capacities. I help co-chair the Intersectionality Committee. I'm a member, rather co-chair of the Psychedelic Policy Reform Issue Group, and hoping to come on to do some more equity work at SSDP.
Now, TribeHerald, we are all about diversity and we're trying to center, voices of color. As we know, the war on drugs has equated to a war against brown and black people for so many years. And decriminalization and legalization is starting to pour money into a lot of pockets, but not that many pockets of brown and black people. Oriana, did you want to speak to, some of the impacts that the war on drugs and drug criminalization has had on, black and brown communities?
Sure. Yeah, there's a wonderful resource. The Drug Policy Alliance has this really cool history of the war on drugs brief that I would really recommend folks read, which really talks about how the war on drugs is actually just a war on black and brown people and bodies, and they provide information as to why that is. And a lot of I'll speak for myself and say a lot of my work in the movement is to center and uplift and amplify the voices of BIPOC folks. This connects loosely, but I'll just say quickly, Luis is the first director of color for SSDP, right? The war on drugs and the racism that's sort of inherent in it, right, impacts many, many things, right? Not just the criminalization that we have numbers for, but even institutionally, right? What organizations look like internally and externally.
I was going to say, Luis, did you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, as Oriana said, every legislation, prohibitory legislation has been historically directly tied to some sort of minority group that has been discriminated against, and in the ways that the US has enforced that among Americans is very much in a racist fashion, and then around the world in a very colonialistic fashion. I'm having a hard time responding to this because for me, the harms of the war on drugs, the prohibition, are just so evident to me that it's very difficult for me to sit here and say, well, throwing police at the problem was never the solution, but also when the cops don't get involved in a way that actually helps the community, it also leads to problems. It's making it very hard for me to respond, but just criminalization unfortunately had people of color front and center, but in the wrong ways.
You brought up the P word, talking about police. We see that, black and brown people have been, even in places like when the 5 boroughs decriminalized, black and brown people were still being pulled to the side and still being stopped and frisked and still being, searched for drugs, which their average white counterpart can smoke in public and it be a non-issue. Do you see, even in areas where we're talking about decriminalization and legalization and things like that, that black and brown people are still being targeted for, for negative treatment by police?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a a lot of various institutions that have come out with research. I live and work out of Colorado, and we legalized here. However, there is still a disproportionate amount of arrests for in Black and brown communities.
Black and brown people are still being arrested for cannabis in Colorado?
Yes, yes, they are. Which is shocking, and there's a number of reasons for why that is, and none of them are good. Like, it's all just because the police cannot readjust, and there are unfortunately specific pieces of legislation that bar people from accessing the legal market in ways that would stop some of this criminalization, frankly.
And just,
go ahead.
Well, just one thing to add, you know, I'm going to say this, you know, from the beginning, I'm going to be pivoting and framing all this more of the interpersonal element of the war on drugs, because that's where I'm at today. So the policing, you know, yes, we're talking about policing, right, on a literal, right, the police, but man, Black and brown people are policed, you know, by movement builders and people, community, quote unquote, leaders in the space for just showing up, right, and talking about the disparity that we're seeing, right, the impact of the war on drugs on people of color. I'm also seeing it from an interpersonal perspective that, yes, it's happening in the streets. Literally, they're arresting folks for cannabis use in Colorado, and then it's also happening interpersonally in the movement work that we're doing. And the barriers that people of color constantly have, either we get arrested on the street or we actually can't make it that far up the career pipeline, right? Because there's some sort of continuous racialized violence that we're encountering.
As we know that, you know, cannabis is now poised to become a multi-billion-dollar industry across the US and Canada. But we don't see Black and brown faces at the forefront of this. We see very few cannabis entrepreneurs that are people of color. We see very little venture capital and very little funding going into cannabis businesses that are run by people of color. Do you think that that legalization is just going to be another branch of racism?
Yes, if it is not done correctly. So one thing about the work of SSDP and ending the war on drugs, it cannot just be centered around drug policy reform. It is an intersectional movement. We must be intentional about addressing the racism, the sexism, ableism that, you know, unfettered capitalism, frankly, has sort of perpetuates. And in thinking about how we create this legislation, it's one of the best things about Students for Sensible Drug Policies. We're for sensible drug policies. We believe in creating a world that we want to live in, not just ending bad policy. And that's what's happening with this legislation. People are trying to push because they think, oh, this was like the next step. This was the only way to break the barrier. But what happened was that it broke the barrier for rich white people, and rich white people started benefiting from it, started removing the stigma of cannabis use, but didn't remove it from the people of color who used it because they could still be criminalized for being poor, for being whatever.
Yeah, and a gentle reframe, or rather, like, this is one of the reasons why I love talking about these things with Luis, is that I differ a little bit in my response, in that I think for me, the answer to your question, Yitz, right, is whether or not legalization is going to be another branch of racism. The answer to me is yes, even if we do it correctly, right? Because everything was built on the premise of white supremacy. We were built in capitalism. So for me, the question isn't, you know, is it going to be? It inevitably will be. As long as we are alive, it will likely, and my grandchildren probably, it will be. But for me, the question is, are we as a movement going to be able to do the work necessary to confront and always name this issue, right? So that we're doing something about it. I would like something to be done before MDMA becomes a $2 trillion industry, right? I mean, can we figure out a way? Cannabis is ruined for me, it feels like. Can we figure out a way to, like, do something before the other drugs get legalized so that we're not seeing the same replication happening? That's
now,
sort of
you bring up a very interesting point. You know, moving on to psychedelics, cannabis, like you said, is already becoming a multi-billion-dollar industry, but the psychedelics industry is starting to take shape. And starting to concentrate on more things like therapeutic applications of psychedelics, applications for mushrooms, applications for MDMA. But we don't see Black and brown people benefiting from this. We see mostly, like you said, the rich white people who are able to pay hundreds of dollars per treatment to be able to benefit from psychedelics.
And then the Black and brown folks that do the work, they have to do it underground because the stakes are too high, right? I can't be a public facing person and be doing MDMA therapy on the low, forget it, right? There's psychedelic water. I don't know, Luis, if you saw that on Facebook the other day. I mean, they're putting psychedelic on everything, psychedelic vitamins, psychedelic salt. It is becoming, right, they call it the Renaissance. My people call it the gold rush, right? We're seeing, and we need to remember that during the gold rush, there was the Oregon Trail and people ate each other there, right, to survive. That is happening. It's just happening in a different, more sexy, more colorful way, but it's happening.
Do you see this this gold rush? Do you see the gold rush from psychedelics just being an extension of colonization, or is this something that you think will eventually benefit Black and brown communities?
What do you think, Luis? I have an answer, but curious what you think.
I have a lot of faith in the Black and brown psychedelic activists that have been fighting like hell to make sure that white people don't ruin this for everyone. However, as right now, I think the psychedelic movement within the US at least, I'm not really sure how it is across the world, but within the US at least, the psychedelic movement needs to take a moment to really pause and reflect on what they value and where they stand as far as inclusion, diversity, and actually making this equitable for everyone, because trickle-down rights do not work.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I'm starting to lean on your side on that, Luis. I think you may be right on the trickle down. Even though I was a big trickle down person, I'm starting to see the other way. I think to answer your question, it's directly around, do I think, again, everything is going to be an extension of colonization forever, right? For me, it's more, I think, the second part of what you asked, of whether or not we're going to be able to find ways to have this medicinal work and healing and therapeutic models and modalities actually benefit the people of color. And so the answer, I think, is yes. We have always been resilient. We have always found ways to access those resources. It's just taking us longer, and we've had to go through more hell. But I do feel that Black and brown people are going to be able to, because of the people who are doing that fighting right now, they are going to be able to have access, but it's going to take a long time, and it's not going to be easy, and it's going to cost us a lot of lives.
It sounds like, I mean, it seems like some of the things like ayahuasca, like peyote, like some of the rituals that are being, celebrated in the psychedelic movement really should be centering indigenous voices, because it's literally from their culture that a lot of this is coming, or maybe it's an issue of cultural appropriation.
I just want to say something just to that, that's actually something beautiful and positive. Oftentimes, as a person of color, I think, man, it's just the white folks, right? They're just ruining everything. But us Black and brown people can be violent too, right? We can appropriate too. We can take too. In fact, I'm double hurt when it's us that does it, because I expect us to know a little better. I don't hold them accountable because that much, because I know that they're going to be. The reason I'm saying this is because we've seen this already happen in the psychedelic community, and I really want to uplift an organization that did the right thing recently, albeit it took some organizing, but they did the right thing. They used a name that was not, they had no indigenous people in their collective, in leadership. They used a name, they appropriated it, and after some deep thought, reflection, and community conversation and accountability, they changed it. That is beautiful. We need more of that. Of course, a Black-led psychedelic group would do that, right? Like, I have faith that my Black and brown communities are receptive to critique and changing. But yeah, it's like, do you know how many ayahuasca centers and whatever the heck they're called, and they charge $4,000, and they're not even paying the people who come to clean up the throw up of these colonizers, right? So I see both. I see the debauchery, and I see the few good moments, right, of transformation that also happen on the ground.
So where, I mean, in these last few minutes of this conversation, as you know, I can't believe that this time has flown so quick. In the last few minutes of this conversation, what does sensible drug policy look like as opposed to unfettered capitalistic drug policy?
Oh, that is a great question. So,
because we see legalization is happening, but you know, legalization is leading to its own issues.
right. So there are a few things that I think are important. I think sensible drug policies kind of need to evolve with what the opposition is doing, with how prohibition as well as the various other systems of oppression have entrenched themselves and adapt to the ways that we approach our liberation. But sensible drug policies must be centered around harm reduction. First and foremost, they must center human beings beyond all of the things. And as far as like, you know, within human beings in America, that is absolutely Black and brown minorities, indigenous individuals within the psychedelic movement and within the broader movement. We need to remember that, again, Black and brown communities, members of Black and brown communities are way more policed, face way more barriers, and are using more drugs than like they're probably speaking up for because of the level of stigmatization. Beyond that, sensible drug policies, as far as SSDP is concerned, must consider and center young people of color, who are people who use drugs, who are children of people who use drugs, who are, you know, unfortunately becoming parents who use drugs, and making sure that as we progress, as we move forward, we don't just demonize young people, pretending that like 18 is when people start using drugs, and instead take a realistic approach to really accept and embrace what young people are doing and how we can best support them in this like harm reduction model.
Okay, two last points. You bring up harm reduction. We know that the opioid crisis has gone through and ravaged America, but we don't see Black and brown people benefiting from the same type of substance abuse counseling. We don't see the same levels of, you know, Black and brown people in these, you know, classier rehabs, things like that. It's usually Black and brown people who have to go to jail for their drug addiction. How do you see young people as being able to, just to, you know, pick harm reduction with opioids as example, how do you see young people being able to change that conversation?
Oh man, how much time do you got?
Yeah.
The shortest answer that I can give is that I mean, young people use opiates, and there are like a number of different reasons why, but like one specific situation that comes to mind is young people are prescribed opiates for their pain because they're on their parents' insurance. If they get off of their parents' insurance, they are now an adult that has no insurance and needs to access their opiates through an illicit market. And so what, you know, like that's just like one minor conversation of like, how do we actually provide access for young people who need help, maybe opioid-assisted treatment, and do it in a way that doesn't require them to go through their parents' insurance so that their parents find out. As far as like how young people are considered in the opioid crisis, first of all, they have been used as a scapegoat. They've been like, what about the children? There are you know, like children in like middle America are using their parents' opiates, and like for that we need to punish patients by restricting their stuff. And rather than having young people be scapegoated, how young people change that conversation is to say, no, we're here. We use drugs for a number of different reasons. Sometimes we need help. Sometimes it's just fun. And you know, the way that young people have shown up so far, at least for the harm reduction movement, is to say people who use drugs, regardless of their age, people who use drugs deserve to be treated as human beings first and foremost. And that's how SSDP has been showing up so far, and moving forward, we hope that, again, we will be able to push for better policies that specifically support young people in the unique situations that they're in.
Are Black and brown people being treated as human beings as it is?
Of course not. And that is I would hope at this point we know that, right? Of course not. And again, everything is drenched in white supremacy, right? So in ableism, like Luis mentioned, in capitalism, right? And we're living under these really oppressive constructs. And so no, they're not getting access to those rehabs. No, they're not getting access to, forget the rehabs. It'd be nice to just get somebody that looks like you and talks like you to talk to you, right? Most of the people who are even in positions of authority are people who are white because they were able to go to school because they had access, right? It's the opposite of trickle down, whatever we want to call that, right? Like there's a school to prison pipeline, right? And then there is the impacts of racism from birth till death. And so again, not to leave it on a sour note, I really love the way, Luis, you reframe everything around liberation. It's very important, right? Yes, these are the situations that we're in, right? We know there's a disparity in treatment. We know there's disparity in access. What can we do? What can literally you and I do to make change that our Black and brown future folks have access to better services, right? And I know that you and I are going to be ancestors someday. I want to leave a great legacy here of folks who really did the best that they could given the limited means that they had to make a better world for each other.
As we
I'm sorry, I just wanted to add one more thing around that, which was just, so one thing that I guess like I don't want to come across in this conversation is that harm reduction is somehow a white concept. Harm reduction was created in Black and brown communities. It has been practiced, and so like we owe a lot to the indigenous Black and brown organizers over the years, and like what the successes of drug policy reform right now are 100% Black and brown and indigenous successes. However, like white people have the ability to again take all this stuff and then monetize it, and nobody blinks an eye. To take these movements and claim that they're bringing unique perspectives to this stuff. And so I don't think that was necessarily what either of you were thinking, but for the general audience, and just to like really drive the point home, like drug policy reform is Latinx, Black and indigenous policy reform. It must center our work. And Ori, to your point, one very important thing that I completely forgot to say, and I'm gonna kick myself for forgetting it. Sensible drug policies must be led by Black and brown and indigenous people. They must be.
That's it. Yeah. And to your, so sorry, yes, never cutting you off. But to your question, right? If I were answering that too, that's what I would have said, right? It's centering the voices of marginalized folks, prioritizing Black and brown indigenous, right? But when I say marginalized, I mean all marginalized folks, right? Queer folks, disabled folks, right? And just giving priority to Black and brown people, right? Because we here at SSDP, we want to have a strong anti-racist lens, right? That's how since the war on drugs is a war on Black and brown bodies, we have to have a strong anti-racist lens to do effective drug policy change.
Now, one last, very last point as we're about to end. We're coming into the Passover holiday, a holiday that's all about liberation, all about redemption from slavery, all about, a group of people being redeemed from, a horrible situation and being able to be led into a promised land. The prison industrial complex, if we want to talk about slavery, if we're going to talk about labor, and we're going to talk about, forced economic output from a class of people, do you think that we're going to see the economic issues that come from criminalization addressed anytime soon?
Oh,
we have a class of people working.
You want to leave us on a negative note.
Well, do you see that do you see a light at the end of this tunnel?
I don't yet. But what I do see is a whole lot of people working hard as hell to make sure that there is one. And what Oregon has done with the decriminalization of all drugs is possibly one of the closest things to a full step in the right direction that we have done as a movement. And now that we know that that is possible within the U.S., I think that our mission, in order to get to this next step of making sure that the war on drugs is not does not continue to be a system of oppression, and in the ways that we move forward, we undo the damage that it has done, is going to be full decrim now. And there are a lot of people pushing, a lot of people organizing, and a lot of people trying to make this happen. But you know, to your question, I don't see a light at the end of the tunnel, but I'm gonna keep fighting because everybody around me is driven as hell, and I believe in our ability to make it happen.
Oriana, are you also on that Ta-Nehisi Coates pessimism level, or are you, or do you see a light at the end of the tunnel?
No, believe it or not, even though I am framed as so pessimistic, I actually have a lot of faith. I'm a person of deep faith, and I'm really glad that you brought up Passover, actually, because this came up today in my somatic therapy. I hold the tension of being a person of profound faith and also having a lot of whiteness inside of me, which for me looks like a lot of internalized fragmentation, splintering, overthinking myself. Even when I say stuff, you know, to my partner, I'll stop myself and correct myself 10 times before I'm really saying what I'm saying. And I bring this up because you mentioned Passover. And, you know, real quick, my breaking moment last night with the racialized violence that I was dealing with within the drug policy community, specifically the harm reduction community in an online space, my breaking moment was actually when Passover was brought up. That is when I had enough. And it's interesting, right? Because yes, it is, Passover is such an important holiday. It's one of the few that I really look forward to every year. It's so much about liberation. I really lean on the JVPs, you know, liberation seders that happen every year. And for somebody to bring up Passover during a really highly contentious fight on racism regarding harm reduction, yeah, we can edit this out, but it was relevant at the time. That's all I want to say.
Any final note you want to leave us with? Any blessing you want to give to everyone?
Yeah, if you're listening to this and anything about this conversation interested you, please come check out SSDP. We are so interested in involving community folks, students across the world to join our movement, and yeah, come build with us.
Luis?
I'm gonna echo everything that Oriana said. We invite you into this movement. We want you to get involved and to use your power, especially if you're a young person listening to this. Like, you have the power to make a change in the world, and you absolutely deserve to live in a future that you shaped, that is built for you.
And just stressing, this is not just for young people. I have just joined SSDP at 43. So, SSDP is not just for young people.
Absolutely. Everyone is welcome. Yes, come as you are. We are youth-led, and we do center young people, but please come as you are. The war on drugs is a war on all of us. And I believe that with everyone's help, we can make it.
We'll leave it at that. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Yitz.